black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left in Black. My name is Sasha Panaram, and I'm a graduate student in the English department at Duke. And we're joined in the studio today with Dr. Kaneesha Parsard. Dr. Parsard is the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago, where she'll be an assistant professor in 2020. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, I want to begin our discussion by talking a little bit about what brings you to Durham and to Duke today. So later today, you'll be participating as part of a panel that I organized called Caribbean Undercurrents, Visual, Sonic, and Haptic Engagements with the Sea, which is sponsored by the Representing Migration Humanities Lab. By way of introduction, talk a little bit about what you work on within the English discipline, and also, without giving away too much, what are you going to be talking about tonight?
Sure. So broadly speaking, I write about and study the aftermath of slavery and Indian indentureship in the Caribbean, with focus on their representations in literature and visual cultures. I am deeply historicist, so I read archives together with representation, and I am thinking about connection this evening. So without giving away too much, the story begins with a document I found in the Colonial Office records, a correspondence between the Earl of Kimberley, a British colonial administrator, and William Rawson, the then governor of Barbados. And they were talking about connection between various racialized laboring groups, which is always kind of my focus. So I'm excited to dig into those new ideas today.
That's great. So much of your work, and based on how you framed your introduction and also what I know of it by way of reading it, has been about thinking about how do we talk about the Caribbean within transnational Black studies. And I really have been thinking about this, especially with regards to the work that you did around C.L.R. James. And it was a recent article that you had in Small Axe. It was called Barrack Yard Politics, from C.L.R. James, the West Indian form of self-government, to Minty Allen. And part of what I found so remarkable about that piece was the way that you insist that we have to read James's political treatises or his political scholarship up and against the fictional work. And so already you're putting two things in front of us and offering us a way to tease out the connections that you're getting at. And I'd like you to talk a little bit, for those who might not understand, part of the reason you say that we should read these things together is because you not only get a better glimpse of the way that C.L.R. James was thinking about the political within the 1930s in the British West Indies, but also you start to tease out these relationships between West Indian of African descent and also West Indians of Indian descent. And I'm thinking, for those who are not familiar with the Barrack Yard, if you could talk a little bit about that space and what's so compelling for you to go back and return to that. And also, what do you mean when you say a Barrack Yard politics? What are you going after there?
Sure. Well, thank you for reading it so closely. So the Barrack Yard was a housing form that flourished during the early 20th century, and it consisted of long, low buildings centered around open space. And this was where the working people of the city, whether it was Port of Spain, Kingston, or others, would live. And so working people would rent a room, but also share common conveniences like a standpipe or bleaching stones for drying their laundry, as well as a stove or a bathroom with their neighbors. And so it brought them into close and sometimes fractious contact. And C.L.R. James wrote about the Barrack Yard setting, not only in Minty Alley, but also in the short fiction he wrote with the Beacon Group, which was a transnational Trinidadian literary group that functioned between the 1920s and 1930s, roughly. So what I was interested in was not only James's own sense of politics in the 1930s, which functioned in part around the question of self-government for the British West Indies, shifting from colony status to dominion status for much of the region, but also how that political vision left out informal, small-scale political practices. And so in many ways, although he wrote Minty Alley just 3 years after the case for West Indian self-government, so 1936 as opposed to 1933, he never fully realized the political possibility that lay in the barrack yard. So he once mentioned in a late interview in the 1980s with the literary critic Kenneth Ramchand that he was attracted to the barrack yard because it contained what he called explosions, which were foreign to him as a member of the Black middle class in Trinidad. He often also wrestled with the question of gender in ways that I had to kind of dig into the novel to tease out. But what he laid out for us, even if he didn't fully delimit it himself, is the fact that African descendants and Indian descendants are kind of thrown into urban spaces like the barrack yard in the post-emancipation period, moving kind of with the shift in economics, the decline of the sugar industry, and encountering one another. So what happens when they encounter one another? The narrative has always either been one of antipathy, simple antipathy, or a kind of romantic recovery that is easy to desire. But what I'm interested in is how African and Indian descendants were making lives and making communities together. And so I focus in the kind of close of the article on a scene in which Benoit and Mrs. Rouse, the two owners of number 2 Minty Alley and partners for 18 years, have gone through a number of rows, separations, coming back together. And Mrs. Rouse remarks that, Benoit is sick and she can't leave him in the hospital to fend for himself. She says, I believe, we sweat and build together to make this house. And in that way, the house can be kind of taken as the kind of common condition of the West Indies in this moment between emancipation and independence, and sweating and building together, because Benoit is a man of African and Indian descent and Mrs. Rouse is of African descent, I think can be kind of a model for how African and Indian working people are struggling together, not only in the sense of strikes or in labor organizing more generally, but also in the sense of creating community, caring for one another, and struggling together in the everyday life of a working class person. So.
One of the words that comes up a few times in that piece is you tease out the relationship between the two characters that you've named, and also thinking about indentureship and afterlives of slavery more broadly. You use the term intimate. And I couldn't help but think of Lisa Lowe's Intimacies of Four Continents. And if you can, talk a little bit about the influence of her work on your scholarship, and even beyond that, sort of how do you conceptualize those types of relationships that you're describing or you just described?
Absolutely. So, my work really wouldn't be possible if I hadn't encountered the book chapter version of the Intimacies of Four Continents that came out in 2006, I believe, in Anne Laura Stiller's Haunted by Empire volume. I read it as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania in David Eng's seminar. I believe it was Asian Diaspora Film. Okay. And so I was already thinking about the afterlives of slavery and indentureship, though of course at that time I didn't have that vocabulary, but how are the descendants of enslaved peoples and indentured peoples meeting one another, and what does that meeting have to do with the formation of Caribbean nation states, and of how we conceive of the modern world more generally. So I was really taken by not only Lisa Lowe's kind of laying out for us the landscape of the Trinidad experiment, which first brought Asian labor to Trinidad in 1803, but also the way she dug into the imaginative possibilities of Caribbean literature to think about how this kind of meeting indexes a lot of really critical formations like settler colonialism, slavery and emancipation, and indentureship. So in these kinds of meetings, crossings, etc., you can think about the modern world more generally. And so that inspired me to think about these kinds of meetings in my own way. And yes.
That's great. You write a little bit about Lisa Lowe in a book review that you have for American Quarterly. And it's interesting because I don't even think it should be called a book review, because it's such an elegant synthesis of 5 different texts, including Lowe, but also Neil Roberts' Freedom is Marinage, Natasha Lightfoot's Troubling Freedom, Rosalind King's Island Body, and Gayatri Bahadur's Kuli Woman. And you know, there's a way, now granted, I'll say this, that I read them back to back, that article or that book review and then the C.L.R. James piece.
Oh, sure.
So, but I think even beyond that, there's a way that sort of the ideas that you're putting down in that piece where you're synthesizing these books together really do gesture to some of the intellectual commitments that you have now and that have emerged in the work that you're doing now. And I have to say I was taken by the ending of both the book review and then also the article. And you kind of gestured to this a little bit earlier, where you talk about looking at the barrack yard space can enliven or enlighten us to different possibilities for West Indian intimacies, to put it one way. And you talk at the end of that article about, you make this move to gesture towards a certain type of ungovernability. And in the book review, it's interesting too, because you talk about the way that reading these texts together, the way that in Lowe's text, she references the Caribbean but doesn't necessarily take it up as prominently as, say, perhaps some of the other ones. But the way that, you know, we can talk about a certain type of sovereignty in relationship to like an English-speaking West Indian Caribbean space, but we can also talk about flight, and we can also talk about a refusal of what freedom might have meant for some. And all of those things, an ungovernable position and flight and marinage and then a traditional conception of freedom perhaps, those are very different possibilities.
Yes.
And the very distinct things and mean things mean things differently for different communities of color especially. And part of what I was thinking about in reading all 3 of those things, or all 2 of those things together, is the way that your work pushes us to think about, you know, the conception of how we narrate histories, or political histories, and what it means to do that from this moment, sort of belatedly looking back. And I guess one of the questions I have is, what advice do you have for people who are doing this type of work, where you are looking from this position of now, or present moment, and trying to attune us to different repositories of knowledge that may have fallen at the wayside? What are your strategies for doing that, and how might you instruct others to do that with you?
Oh, well, thank you again for that really insightful question. I would say that the way that I'm attuned to questions of refusal, and that's probably the term that I would use the most to describe my intellectual commitments, none of that would be possible without thinking about the critical practice of a journal like Small Acts, where David Scott has been undertaking interviews with, you know, among other various projects, but interviews with our Caribbean intellectuals from generations past. And I think that practice in the journal and that outlook in his work and in the work of his interlocutors and students has been really influential to me in terms of thinking about, well, in my case, if we know that in places like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, racialized party politics have, a history of rancor, of violence at times. What might we learn from this period between Indian arrival and that first meeting and the moment when these nation states coalesced and made way for a new kind of struggle? And so I think that's one thing about temporality. And in thinking about temporality, it's also about valuing practices, valuing production, I think, that may have been extinguished for one reason or another, but are no less valuable to us. So I think of my work on the kept woman, which I'll be talking about a little bit tonight, and thinking about how the kept woman, for example, is a figure that kind of flourished in barrack yard short fiction of the 1930s. And when, tracing the path of the kept woman in and out of her rooms with her various lovers, it's important to note that she's not only kind of refusing bourgeois sexual mores, but also outlining a different relationship to capital. So if, she is being kept by someone who is also supporting a spouse and children, there's a way that the wage is being interrupted. So the typical family wage that is determined to support a given worker and his family then ends up being spread in this way that is by no means uncomplicated, but also gives us a glimpse into a gendered and sexual economy, political economy, that is important when we consider contemporary formations today, like tourism and sex work, about which I've learned a lot from scholars like Kamala Kempadu and many, many others in Caribbean sexualities. So that's a long way of saying that making sure to look back and linking those, I think, to contemporary concerns in order to think about a history of the present is always fruitful and has led me to not just figures of interest, but kind of intellectual ancestors in a way, as I think about kept women or errant wives or other figures. So.
That piece about intellectual ancestors, it resonates so nicely with what you said before about small acts and the way that they trace these generational genealogies that are so important for us to return to in the work that we do. What's next for you?
Oh, what's next? Well, the wonderful conversation this evening. I'm also really looking forward to a celebration at Yale University later this month, where I'm going to be honoring my advisor, Inderpal Grewal, and thinking about feminist practice in the university. And I think that leads me kind of into my, the next few months when I'll be really digging into my book project. And as you know, I'm shifting things a bit, or beginning to shift things a bit, where I've written in the past about housing and planning, those histories and representations. I'm starting to think more centrally about the role that gender and sexuality has for a kind of post-emancipation political economy in the West Indies. So I think this conversation and the one coming up for me in the next 2 weeks, I believe, will put me in a great place to outline those new ideas.
That's great. That's wonderful. We've been joined today on Left of Black with Dr. Kaneesha Parsard. Dr. Parsard is the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago, where she'll start as an assistant professor in 2020. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking